evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Got a story tonight that goes back a long ways to a time when the law was only as good as the men who wore the badge. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let me tell you what happened in a little town called Ridgewood. The autumn the courthouse burned down. Some truths, they stay buried for a long, long time. But fire has a way of bringing things to the surface that were never meant to see the light again. The courthouse burned on a Tuesday night in the autumn of 1889. By the time the bucket line formed, half the building was already gone. Sheriff Emmett Graves pulled what he could from the flames. Chairs, a desk, a stack of files so hot they singed the hair off his forearms. Most of those files were ruined, black and crumbling. But one of them, one half-burned folder tied with a piece of string, would keep him awake for the next 3 months. Because inside that folder were 3 names. 3 men who had testified under oath 20 years ago. 3 men who had watched a man hang for something he did not do. And all 3 of them had become rich the very same year. Emmett did not open that folder until the next morning. The night of the fire was spent hauling water and beating back flames and making sure nobody was trapped inside the building. By dawn, the courthouse was a skeleton of charred beams and smoking rubble. The whole town smelled of ash and wet timber. Emmett sat on the steps of his office across the street, his face black with soot, his shirt ruined, and the folder resting on his knee. He untied the string carefully. The paper was brittle and warm to the touch. Half the pages crumbled the moment he turned them, but enough remained. Enough to read. It was a trial transcript from the spring of 1869. The defendant was a man named Henry Calloway. The charge was the theft of 4 horses from the McCandless Ranch, which at that time was the largest and most powerful operation in the county. The trial had lasted less than 2 days. The verdict was guilty. Henry Calloway was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. The sentence was carried out 3 weeks later in the town square. Emmett had been a boy of 8 years old when Henry Calloway was hanged. He remembered it, though he wished he did not. His father, Thomas Graves, had been the sheriff of Ridgewood at the time. Thomas had stood on the platform beside the hangman, his face as hard and still as the mountains to the west. Emmett remembered the sound of the trapdoor. He remembered his mother pulling him away, pressing his face into her skirt. He remembered the silence that followed, a silence so thick it seemed to have weight. Now, 20 years later, he held the remains of that trial in his hands, and on the witness page, 3 names were listed. 3 men who had sworn they saw Henry Calloway leading those horses away from the McCandless property on the night of March 14th, 1869. The first name was Douglas Fenton. The second was Horace Mackey. The third was Virgil Dunn. Emmett set the folder down and stared at the street. Douglas Fenton owned the bank. Horace Mackey owned the lumber mill and half the buildings on the east side of town. Virgil Dunn ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, second only to the McCandless Ranch itself, which had been broken up and sold years ago. 3 witnesses. 3 men who had been nothing more than common ranch hands in 1869. 3 men who had all become wealthy within a year or 2 of Henry Calloway's hanging. Emmett's hands were steady. They had always been steady. It was one of the things that made him good at his job. But his mind was not steady. His mind was turning over and over like a wheel stuck in mud because the question forming in his head was one he did not want to ask. What if Henry Calloway had been innocent? And what if his own father, Sheriff Thomas Graves, had known it? He did not tell anyone about the folder. Not yet. He locked it in the bottom drawer of his desk and spent the rest of that day dealing with the aftermath of the fire. People needed reassurance. The mayor needed a report. The insurance man from the city needed to inspect the damage. Emmett handled all of it with his usual calm, shaking hands, answering questions, organizing the cleanup crew with the same steady voice he used for everything. But underneath that calm, the three names burned hotter than anything the fire had produced. He went home that evening smelling of smoke and exhaustion. His house was a small, tidy place on the south end of town. The house his father had built when Emmett was still a boy. It had a porch that faced west, toward the mountains, and Emmett had spent more evenings than he could count sitting on that porch watching the sun go down. Tonight, he did not sit. He poured himself a glass of water, washed the soot from his hands and face, and changed into a clean shirt. Then he walked back to his office in the dark. The streets of Ridgewood were quiet. A dog barked somewhere near the livery stable. The smell of burned timber hung in the cool autumn air like a ghost that would not leave. Emmett unlocked his office, lit the lamp, and sat down at his desk. The coffee from that morning was still there, cold and bitter. He drank it anyway. He pulled the folder out again and read every surviving word by lamplight. The transcript was incomplete. Fire had eaten most of the testimony, but what remained painted a clear enough picture. Henry Calloway had been a homesteader. He had a small piece of land on the western edge of the valley, 40 acres of decent grazing ground with a creek running through it. He had a wife named Ruth and a daughter named Eliza, who would have been about 4 years old at the time of the trial. According to the transcript, Calloway claimed he had been home that night, asleep in his bed. His wife had testified to the same, but 3 witnesses, Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn, all swore under oath that they had seen Calloway on the McCandless property that night, leading 4 horses through the back gate, 3 against 1. The jury deliberated for less than 40 minutes. Emmett leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He tried to remember his father talking about the Calloway case. Thomas Graves had not been a talkative man, especially about his work. But there were nights when Emmett was young, when his father would sit on the porch with a glass of whiskey and stare at nothing. His mother once told him, in a rare moment of openness, that your father carries things he cannot set down. Thomas Graves had died in the winter of 1881, 8 years ago. A heart attack took him in his sleep. Emmett inherited the badge, the house, and a locked trunk in the attic that he had never opened because his mother asked him not to. His mother, she was still alive, living in the house on Maple Street where Emmett had grown up. She was 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and as private as a locked safe. Emmett loved her, but he had learned long ago that there were rooms in her mind that she kept shut, and she did not hand out keys. He would not ask her about the Calloway case, not yet. First, he needed to find out what had happened to Henry Calloway's family. The next morning, Emmett rode to the county records office in Habsburg, 12 miles east. The clerk there was a meticulous young man named Avery, who treated every document like a holy relic. Emmett asked him to pull anything related to Henry Calloway, Ridgewood, 1869. Avery disappeared into the back room and returned 20 minutes later with a thin file. "Not much here," he said. "Calloway Henry, convicted of grand larceny, horse theft, sentenced to death by hanging. Executed April 8, 1869. Wife, Ruth Calloway. One child, Eliza Calloway, age 4. He looked up. The wife filed a petition for clemency before the execution. It was denied. "By whom?" Emmett asked. Avery checked the document. "Judge Walter Pruitt." "What happened to the wife and daughter after the execution?" "No record of them after 1870. They appear to have left the area." Emmett took the file and thanked Avery. On the ride back, he turned the facts over in his mind. Ruth Calloway had tried to save her husband. She had failed. Then, she had taken her daughter and disappeared. 20 years of silence. But someone had written, "God forgive," in the margin of that trial transcript. Someone who had been there, who had known, and who had carried that knowledge like a stone in their chest. Back in Ridgewood, Emmett began his investigation quietly. He did not announce it. He did not write anything down in the official log. He simply began talking to people, the way a good sheriff does, casually, over coffee, over fences, after church. He started with old Nate Rawlings, who ran the livery stable and had been in Ridgewood since before the town had a name. Nate was 82, and his memory was spotty, but when Emmett mentioned the Calloway trial, something shifted in the old man's eyes. "Calloway?" Nate repeated slowly. He was brushing a horse, his movements automatic. "That was a dark business." "How so?" Emmett asked, keeping his voice easy. Nate was quiet for a long time. The brush moved back and forth across the horse's flank with a steady rhythm. "There were folks who had doubts," he said finally. "Not many who said it out loud, mind you. McCandless was a powerful man. Nobody wanted to cross him." "What kind of doubts?" "The kind that keep you up at night." Nate stopped brushing and looked at Emmett. "Your daddy was a good man, Emmett. I want you to know that. Whatever else you might hear, Thomas Graves was a good man who got caught in a bad situation." "What situation, Nate?" But the old man shook his head and went back to his brushing. "I have said too much already. I am an old man. Let the dead rest." Emmett did not push. He had learned that pushing rarely worked with people Nate's age. But the words stayed with him. A good man who got caught in a bad situation. Over the next 2 weeks, Emmett visited every person over the age of 60 in Ridgewood and the surrounding area. Most of them had little to say about the Calloway case. Some did not remember it at all, or claimed not to. A few gave him the same guarded look that Nate had given him, a look that said they knew more than they were willing to share. It was a woman named Agnes Fairchild who finally cracked the silence open. Agnes was 75, a former schoolteacher who lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of town. She had taught Emmett when he was a boy, and she still called him young man, even though he was pushing 38. She invited him in for tea and listened to his questions with a calm that unsettled him. When he finished, she set her cup down and folded her hands. "I wondered when someone would come asking," she said. "I just did not expect it to be you." "Why not?" She looked at him with eyes that were clear and steady despite her age. Thomas was the one who arrested Henry Calloway. He was the one who brought him to trial, and he was the one who stood on that platform when they pulled the lever. "I know all that," Emmett said, though hearing it from her made it feel different, heavier. "Do you know why Henry Calloway was really arrested?" Agnes asked. The question hung in the air between them. The clock on her mantel ticked softly. "He was arrested for stealing horses," Emmett said. "He was arrested because his land was in the way." Agnes leaned forward. "Emmett, you are old enough and smart enough to hear this. In 1869, Josiah McCandless wanted to expand his ranch. He needed the Western Valley, all of it. Most of the homesteaders sold when he made his offers. The prices were fair enough, and McCandless was not a man you argued with. But Henry Calloway refused. He loved that piece of land. He told McCandless that his family was staying, and that was the end of it." She paused, her thin fingers gripping her teacup. 3 weeks later, 4 horses disappeared from the McCandless ranch, and 3 men came forward to say they had seen Henry Calloway take them. "Emmett?" said McHale. Emmett said, "Yes, 3 ranch hands who worked for McCandless. 3 men who had nothing to their name but the clothes on their backs and the wages McCandless paid them." Agnes looked at him. Within a year of Henry's hanging, all 3 of them had enough money to buy property, start businesses, and build the fine homes they still live in today. Does that not strike you as peculiar? Emmett's throat was dry. It does. Your father knew, Agnes said quietly. I am not saying he was part of it. I am saying he knew. He saw what was happening, and he could not stop it. McCandless had the judge, the witnesses, and the money. Thomas was a sheriff in a small town with no resources and no allies. He did what the law told him to do, even when the law was being used as a weapon. How do you know all this? Emmett asked. Because your father told me. She saw the shock on his face and nodded slowly. He came to see me in the winter of 1875, 6 years after the hanging. He sat right where you are sitting now, in that very chair. He had his hat in his hands, and he turned it over and over, the way men do when they are trying to find the courage to say something they have been holding inside for too long. Agnes poured more tea, though neither of them had touched their cups. The ritual of it seemed to steady her. He was not a man who showed his feelings, your father, but that night he was close to breaking. I could see it in his jaw, the way it trembled just slightly, like a wire pulled too tight. He told me everything. He said he had tried to investigate, tried to find proof that the witnesses were lying, but McCandless blocked him at every turn. Every document he requested was denied. Every person he tried to interview suddenly could not remember a thing. McCandless had the judge in his pocket, the county clerk, even the newspaper editor. By the time the trial was over, it was too late. Did he tell you why he did not speak up publicly? Emmett asked, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. Agnes looked at him with a gentleness that made the truth easier to bear. He said McCandless came to see him the night before the hanging. He said McCandless told him, very calmly, that if Thomas made trouble, his wife and his son would find themselves in a difficult situation. He did not use the word threat. He did not have to. Your father understood exactly what was being said. Emmett felt something cold settle in his stomach. His father had been silenced, not by his own weakness, but by a threat to his family, to Emmett's mother, to Emmett himself. He chose you, Agnes said softly, reading his face. He chose to keep his family safe. You can judge him for that if you want to, but I never did. Why did he come to you? Emmett asked, his voice rough. Because I was Henry Calloway's teacher, Agnes said simply. I taught him to read when he was 7 years old. I watched him grow into a decent, honest man. And your father knew that I had never believed the verdict. She paused. He needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand. He needed someone to know that he had tried. Emmett sat in that cottage for a long time after Agnes finished talking. The tea grew cold. The shadows lengthened. When he finally stood to leave, Agnes caught his arm. Be careful, Emmett, she said. Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn are powerful men now. They have spent 20 years building their lives on a lie. They will not let you tear it down without a fight. I am the sheriff, Emmett said. So was your father, Agnes replied softly. He rode home in the dark, the weight of everything Agnes had told him pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. His father had known. Thomas Graves had known that an innocent man was going to hang, and he had not been able to stop it. He had carried that knowledge for the rest of his life, and it had eaten him from the inside out. Emmett thought about those nights on the porch, the whiskey, the silence, the way his father's eyes would sometimes go far away, as if he were looking at something no one else could see. Your father carries things he cannot set down. Now Emmett was carrying them too. The next day, he made a decision. He was going to find Ruth and Eliza Calloway. If Henry's wife and daughter were still alive, they deserved to know the truth. And if Emmett was going to build a case against the 3 witnesses, he would need their testimony. He sent letters to every county office within 200 miles. He placed a notice in 3 newspapers, carefully worded so as not to alarm anyone. He described it as a routine matter related to old property records. And then he waited. While he waited, he began to dig into the finances of the 3 men. This was delicate work. Douglas Fenton ran the bank, which meant he controlled most of the financial records in town. Horace Mackey was on the town council. Virgil Dunn had connections to the territorial governor. These were not men who could be investigated openly. But Emmett was patient. He talked to old business partners, retired clerks, anyone who might remember the early days of the 3 men's sudden prosperity. Piece by piece, a picture began to form. In 1870, the year after Henry Calloway's execution, all 3 men had received large sums of money from the McCandless estate. The payments were recorded as wages for consulting work, but the amounts were 10 times what any ranch hand would earn in a year. McCandless himself had died in 1874, thrown from a horse. His ranch had been broken up and sold, but the money he had paid to the 3 witnesses had been the seed from which their fortunes grew. 3 weeks after sending his letters, Emmett received a reply. It came from a town called Cedar Falls, nearly 150 miles to the north. The letter was written in a careful, educated hand. Dear Sheriff Graves, I am writing in response to your notice regarding property records related to the Calloway family. My name is Eliza Calloway Foster. Henry Calloway was my father. I have waited 20 years for someone to ask about him. If you are willing to listen, I have a great deal to tell you. I can make the journey to Ridgewood within the month. Please advise if this is acceptable. Respectfully, Eliza C. Foster. Emmett read the letter 3 times. His hands were steady, but his heart was not. He wrote back immediately, telling her she was welcome, that he would ensure her safety, and that he was prepared to listen to everything she had to say. While he waited for Eliza's arrival, things in Ridgewood began to shift. Emmett could not be sure, but he felt watched. It was nothing he could point to, nothing specific, just a feeling, the kind a lawman develops after years of reading the air around him. Douglas Fenton came into the sheriff's office one morning with a basket of baked goods from his wife. "Helen wanted you to have these," he said with his usual broad smile. "She says you work too hard and eat too little." "That is kind of her," Emmett said. "Thank you." Fenton lingered. He picked up a paperweight from Emmett's desk and turned it over in his hands. "Terrible thing about the courthouse," he said. "All those old records, just gone. Some things are better left in the past, I suppose." "I suppose," Emmett agreed, his face giving nothing away. "You know, Emmett, your father and I were friends for many years," Fenton said, setting the paperweight down. "He understood how things worked in this town. He knew that sometimes the best thing a sheriff can do is keep the peace, even if it means letting certain questions go unasked." Emmett met his eyes. "My father was a good man." "He was," Fenton said. "The best. And he would not have wanted his son stirring up old ghosts." After Fenton left, Emmett sat motionless for a full 5 minutes. That visit had not been about baked goods. It had been a warning, delivered with a smile and a plate of cookies. Fenton knew. Somehow, he knew that Emmett was digging. 2 days later, Horace Mackey stopped Emmett on the street. "I hear you have been asking around about the old days," Mackey said. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were not. "Funny thing, a man suddenly getting interested in history." "I have always liked history," Emmett said. "Well, be careful with it," Mackey said. "History has a way of biting the hand that digs it up." That was 2 warnings in 2 days. Emmett expected the 3rd, and it came that evening. Virgil Dunn was waiting on the porch of the sheriff's office when Emmett returned from his rounds. Dunn was the quietest of the 3, a lean man with a face like old leather and eyes that gave away nothing. "Evening, Sheriff," Dunn said. "Mr. Dunn." "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," Dunn said. "I know what you found in that fire. I know you have been asking questions, and I know you sent letters looking for the Calloway family." Emmett did not react. He simply waited. "You are making a mistake," Dunn continued. "What happened 20 years ago was justice. A man stole horses, and he paid the price. The witnesses told the truth, the judge made his ruling, and the law was served. There is nothing to investigate." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Emmett said. Dunn stared at him for a long moment. "Your father understood the way of things." "My father is dead," Emmett said quietly, "and I am the sheriff now." Something shifted in Dunn's face. It was not fear. It was something colder, something calculating. "Be very sure about what you are doing, Graves. very sure. He walked away into the evening shadows without another word. Emmett went inside, locked the door, and sat in the dark. 3 powerful men had each come to him within 48 hours, each delivering the same message in different words. Stop looking. That alone told him everything he needed to know. Innocent men do not warn sheriffs away from old cases. Only guilty ones do. Eliza Calloway Foster arrived in Ridgewood on a cool October morning. She came by stagecoach, alone. Emmett was waiting at the station, standing by the post where the horses were tied, his hat in his hands. He had not slept well the night before, turning over in his mind what he would say to the daughter of a man his town had killed. She stepped down from the coach with a small leather bag in one hand and a look on her face that Emmett recognized. It was the look of someone returning to a place that held both the worst and the most important memory of their life. She was 24 years old, with dark hair pinned up neatly and brown eyes that took in everything. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded Emmett of the school teachers and frontier women who held families together through impossible times. There was something in her posture that spoke of years spent standing up straight when the world was trying to push her down. "Sheriff Graves," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm. "Mrs. Foster," he replied, "thank you for coming all this way. I would have walked if I had to," she said, and he believed her completely. He took her to the small hotel on 2nd Street, owned by a widow named Clara Hutchins, who owed no favors to Fenton, Mackey, or Dunn. Clara was a stout, kind woman who asked no questions and had a talent for making people feel safe. She gave Eliza the best room without hesitation and brought up a pot of tea and a plate of sandwiches. "You eat," Clara told her firmly. "Whatever business you have with the sheriff can wait until you have had something warm." Eliza smiled at that, a small smile that softened her whole face. It occurred to Emmett that she probably did not smile very often, and that when she did, it was genuine. They talked in the hotel parlor that afternoon, the light coming through the lace curtains and making patterns on the worn carpet. Eliza sat straight in her chair, her hands folded, her voice clear and controlled. She had been preparing for this conversation for most of her life. "I was 4 years old when they hanged my father," she said. "I do not remember his face. I have tried for 20 years, and I cannot see it. My mother had a photograph, but it was lost when we moved north. All I have is what my mother told me about him." "What did she tell you?" Emmett asked. "That he was gentle, that he loved the land more than anything except his family, that he sang to me every night before bed, old songs from Virginia where he was born." Her voice did not waver, but Emmett could see the effort it cost her to keep it steady. "She told me he was innocent. She said it every single day until the day she died." "When did your mother pass?" Emmett asked softly. 3 years ago. Pneumonia. She never remarried." Eliza paused. "She spent her whole life trying to prove my father's innocence, Sheriff. She wrote letters to judges, to newspapers, to anyone who might listen. Nobody did. After a while, I think it broke something in her. Not her spirit, but her faith. that the world could be made right. "I am sorry," Emmett said, and he meant it with everything he had. "My mother kept things," Eliza continued. She reached into her travel bag and pulled out a worn leather folder. Letters, documents, notes from people who talked to her over the years. She could not get anyone to officially reopen the case, but she never stopped collecting evidence. She opened the folder and laid the contents on the table between them. There were letters from neighbors who had lived near the Calloway homestead, several of them stating that Henry was home the night of the alleged theft. There was a letter from a ranch hand named Pete Dawson, who had worked at the McCandless place and who wrote, in a shaky hand, that he had seen Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn moving horses on the night in question. Not Henry Calloway. Pete Dawson, Emmett said. "Is he still alive?" "He died in 1882, Eliza said, "but his letter is dated and signed. My mother had it witnessed by a notary in Cedar Falls. A record of the land transfer showing that McCandless had purchased the Calloway homestead for a fraction of its value just 2 months after the hanging. The property seized by the county to pay Henry's legal debts. A letter from a clerk in the territorial office noting irregularities in the trial transcript, and a note, handwritten, unsigned, that said simply, 'McCandless paid them. All 3. I was there when the money changed hands. May God have mercy on us all.'" Emmett looked at the unsigned note for a long time. The handwriting was familiar. "Where did your mother get this?" he asked. "It was slipped under her door the night before we left Ridgewood," Eliza said. She never knew who wrote it, but Emmett knew. He had spent his childhood watching that handwriting appear on reports, on grocery lists, on the margins of the newspaper. It was his father's hand. He did not tell Eliza. Not yet. That piece of the truth was too heavy to hand over in a hotel parlor. Instead, he gathered the documents and told her he needed a few days to verify what she had brought. "You are safe here," he said. "Clara Hutchins is a good woman, and I will make sure no one bothers you." "I am not afraid," Eliza said. "My mother was afraid for 20 years. I decided a long time ago that I was done being afraid of the men who killed my father." Emmett went home that night and climbed the stairs to the attic. The staircase was narrow and creaked under his weight, a sound he had known since childhood. The attic was cold and dark, smelling of old wood and mothballs. He lit a candle and set it on the floor. The trunk was still there, in the far corner beneath the sloped roof, covered in dust, exactly where his father had left it. It was a simple pine chest with iron hinges and a brass lock that had turned green with age. His mother had asked him never to open it. She had not explained why, and Emmett had respected her wishes because that was what a good son did. For 8 years, he had walked past the attic stairs, knowing that trunk was up there, holding whatever his father had not been able to carry into the grave. But a good sheriff was something different. He knelt before the trunk and ran his hand across the lid, wiping away the dust. His father's initials were carved into the wood. T.G. Thomas Graves. Emmett could almost see him up here, late at night when the rest of the house was sleeping, writing letters he would never send, trying to put words to a guilt that had no remedy. He broke the lock with a hammer, The sound was sharp in the quiet attic, final, like a decision being made. Inside, he found exactly what he expected. Letters, dozens of them, written in his father's careful, deliberate hand, never sent. They were addressed to Ruth Calloway, to Judge Pruitt, to the territorial governor, even one to a newspaper editor in San Francisco. Each one told the same story, that Thomas Graves believed Henry Calloway had been framed, that the 3 witnesses had been paid by McCandless, and that the trial had been a sham. Some were angry, some were pleading. One, dated 1879, was so short it was barely more than a sentence. I stood on that platform and did nothing. I will carry that until I die. Emmett read them all, one by one, by candlelight. It took him over an hour. By the time he finished, the candle had burned down to a stub and his eyes were stinging, though not entirely from the smoke. At the bottom of the trunk was a sealed envelope with one word written on the front, Emmett. He picked it up and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was almost nothing, but the weight of everything it represented. His father had written this, knowing that one day his son would find it. He had left it here like a man leaving a lantern at the edge of a dark road, trusting that someone would come along who needed the light. He opened it with hands that were no longer steady. Son, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I could not bring myself to destroy. I should have done more. I know that. I should have fought harder, spoken louder, refused to stand on that platform. But I was afraid. McCandless had power that I could not match, and I had a family to protect. That is not an excuse. It is the truth, and the truth is all I have left to give you. Henry Calloway was innocent. The 3 men who testified against him were paid to lie. I watched it happen, and I could not stop it. The unsigned note in Ruth Calloway's possession is mine. I wrote it the night before they left town because I could not face her in person. I have lived with this every day since, and it has cost me more than I can put into words. If the day comes when you can make this right, I am asking you to do it. Not for me. I do not deserve that. Do it for Henry. Do it for his wife and his little girl. Do it because the badge on your chest is supposed to mean something, and I failed to live up to what it stands for. Your father, Thomas Graves. Emmett sat on the attic floor with the letter in his hands for a long, long time. The house was silent around him. Through the small window he could see the stars over Ridgewood, the same stars that had shone over this town the night Henry Calloway was hanged. His father had known. His father had tried in his own limited way and had failed. And then he had carried that failure like a chain around his neck for the rest of his life. I understand now, Emmett whispered to the empty room. The candle flickered, and shadows moved across the sloped walls of the attic. I understand, and I am going to finish it. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Then he closed the trunk, blew out the candle, and went downstairs. The house was dark and quiet. He stood in the kitchen for a while, looking out the window at the street where he had played as a boy, where his father had walked home each evening with the badge on his chest and the weight of the world on his shoulders. He poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly. The next morning, he went to see Judge Franklin Meade in Hapsburg. Meade was the circuit judge who covered 4 counties, and he had a reputation for being fair, thorough, and utterly unbribable. Emmett laid everything on his desk: the half-burned trial transcript, Eliza's documents, Pete Dawson's witness letter, and his father's confession. Meade read everything without speaking. When he finished, he removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "This is a significant matter, Sheriff," he said. "Yes, sir. You understand that if we proceed, it will not be quiet. These are prominent men. The town will be divided. I understand, and you understand that your father's name will be part of this." Emmett met the judge's eyes. "My father's last wish was that I make this right. I intend to honor that." Meade studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I will issue subpoenas for Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn. I want them in my courtroom within 2 weeks. I will also request that the Territorial Attorney's Office send an investigator." He paused. "Sheriff Graves, you should know that once this begins, it cannot be undone. It should have begun 20 years ago," Emmett said. He rode back to Ridgewood knowing that the storm was coming. Within hours of the subpoenas being delivered, the town began to fracture. People who had done business with Fenton's bank worried about their savings. Workers at Mackey's lumber mill feared for their jobs. Ranchers who sold cattle through Dunn's operation wondered if their contracts would hold. Emmett walked through town with his badge on his chest and his back straight, and he answered every question the same way. The law is doing its job. That is all I can tell you. Fenton came to see him one last time. The broad smile was gone. His face was gray and drawn. "You are destroying this town," Fenton said. "I am cleaning it," Emmett replied. "Your father would not have done this. My father asked me to." That stopped Fenton cold. For the first time, something like fear crossed his face. "What do you mean?" "He left me a letter," Emmett said simply. "He told me everything." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The hearing took place on a cold November morning in the Hapsburg courthouse. The sky was heavy and gray, the kind of sky that promised snow before nightfall. Emmett arrived early and stood in the courtroom alone for a few minutes, looking at the empty chairs and the judge's bench and thinking about another courtroom 20 years ago, where a man's life had been weighed and found wanting in less than 40 minutes. Eliza Calloway Foster sat in the front row, wearing a dark blue dress and her mother's locket around her neck. She had told Emmett the night before that her mother had worn that locket every single day since Henry's death. It held a lock of his hair, the only physical piece of him that Ruth had managed to keep. Eliza wore it now like armor. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the proceedings with the same steady gaze that Emmett had first seen at the stagecoach station. Beside her sat Clara Hutchins, who had closed her hotel for the day and ridden 12 miles in the cold to be there. When Emmett had asked her why, Clara had said simply, "Because that girl should not have to sit alone." The courtroom filled slowly. People from Ridgewood and the surrounding towns came, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, a need to see whether the truth once spoken aloud, would hold together or crumble. Agnes Fairchild was there, sitting near the back with a straight spine and her hands folded in her lap. Old Nate Rawlings had come too, his hat in his hands and his face lined with something that looked like relief. Judge Meade was methodical. He presented the evidence piece by piece in a voice that was calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who understood that justice is not served by drama but by clarity. The irregular land transfer, the financial records showing payments from McCandless to the 3 witnesses, Pete Dawson's witness letter read aloud by the court clerk in a voice that trembled slightly on the key passages, the testimony of Agnes Fairchild, who walked to the witness stand with the aid of a cane and sat before the court with a schoolteacher's posture and a voice that did not waver once in 45 minutes. Agnes told the court what she had told Emmett in her cottage. She spoke of Henry Calloway as a boy she had taught to read, a young man she had watched build a life, and an innocent man she had watched die. She spoke of Thomas Graves coming to her home in the winter of 1875, a broken man with a secret he could no longer carry alone. The courtroom was so silent during her testimony that Emmett could hear the scratch of the clerk's pen on paper. And then Meade read Thomas Graves's letter aloud. The courtroom was silent. Emmett sat in his chair and listened to his father's words fill the room, and he felt something he had not expected. Not shame, not anger, relief. His father's secret was no longer a secret. It was evidence, and evidence could do what silence never could. Fenton's lawyer argued. Mackey's lawyer objected. Dunn sat in his chair and said nothing at all, watching the proceedings with those cold, calculating eyes. But the weight of the evidence was too great. Judge Meade ruled that there was sufficient cause to reopen the case and vacate the original conviction. Henry Calloway's death sentence was officially overturned, and his name was cleared of all charges. The ruling did not bring Henry back. It did not give Eliza her father's face, which she still could not remember. It did not return the 20 years that Ruth Calloway had spent fighting a battle she never won, but it placed the truth on the record, in ink, in a courtroom, before witnesses, where it belonged. Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn were charged with perjury and conspiracy. Their trials would come later. All 3 posted bail and returned to Ridgewood, but they were changed men. The town looked at them differently now, the way people look at a building after a fire, seeing the damage that was always there beneath the surface. On the day the ruling was announced, Eliza found Emmett on the steps of the Habsburg courthouse. The November wind was cold, carrying the first promise of winter. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me," Emmett replied. "I should have found that file years ago. Someone should have looked harder, asked more questions." "Someone did," Eliza said. "Your father. He just could not finish it." "No, he could not." She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "He gave it to you. That is not nothing, Sheriff. A man who carries a wrong for 20 years and then passes it to his son so it can be made right, that is not a coward. That is a man who knew his limits and trusted his boy to be stronger." Emmett had not thought of it that way. He stood there on those courthouse steps with the cold wind pulling at his coat, and he let her words settle in. "My mother told me something once," Eliza continued. "She said that justice is not a single act, it is a chain. One person picks it up where another, one set it down. Your father picked it up when he wrote that note and slipped it under our door. My mother picked it up when she spent her life collecting evidence. And you picked it up when you opened that burned folder. She held out her hand. The chain held, Sheriff. That is what matters. He took her hand and shook it. Her grip was firm and sure. Eliza stayed in Ridgewood for another week, visiting her father's grave for the first time. The headstone had been a plain wooden marker with just his name and the year. Emmett arranged for a proper stone to be placed, carved with the words, Henry Calloway, innocent man, beloved husband and father. Eliza stood before the new stone for a long time. Emmett stayed back, giving her the space she needed. When she finally turned around, her eyes were red, but her chin was up. He would have liked this town, she said, if they had let him stay. It is a good town, Emmett said. It just lost its way for a while. She left the next morning, headed back to Cedar Falls, where she had a husband, a small house, and a life she had built from nothing. Before she boarded the stage, she handed Emmett a small package. My mother's folder, she said, the original documents. I want you to have them. These belong to you, Emmett protested. They belong to the record, Eliza said. Keep them in your office, Sheriff. Keep them where people can see them if they need to, so that the next time someone in this town thinks about taking the easy road instead of the right one, they will remember what it costs. He watched the stagecoach until it was just a speck of dust on the road. Then he walked back to his office and placed the folder in the top drawer of his desk, where the light from the window could reach it. That winter was a quiet one. The trials of Fenton, Mackey, and Dunn were scheduled for the spring. The town was healing, slowly, the way towns do. Not with grand gestures, but with small, ordinary acts of decency. People who had looked the other way for 20 years began to look straight ahead. It was not dramatic. It was not fast, but it was real. Emmett went to see his mother on Christmas Eve. The snow had come early that year, covering Ridgewood in a quiet blanket of white that softened every edge and muffled every sound. He walked to her house on Maple Street the way he always did, through the side streets where the elm trees formed a canopy overhead, now bare and black against the pale sky. She was sitting by the fire in the front room, a blanket over her knees and a book in her hands. The house smelled of cinnamon and cedar, the way it always did at Christmas. A small tree stood in the corner, decorated with the same ornaments Emmett remembered from his childhood. Glass balls and tin stars, and a little wooden angel his father had carved the year Emmett was born. She looked up when he came in, and she knew. He could see it in her face, in the way her fingers tightened on the book, in the small, almost imperceptible intake of breath. She had always known. She had been waiting for this conversation for 8 years, maybe longer. You opened the trunk, she said. Yes. She closed her book and set it aside on the small table next to her chair. She removed her reading glasses and placed them on top of the book with a precision that told Emmett she was gathering herself, arranging her composure the way she arranged everything in her life, neatly and with purpose. I asked you not to, she said. I know. I am sorry. Are you? She looked at him with eyes that were so much like his father's, the same shade of gray, the same depth. Or, are you sorry it took you this long? He sat down across from her. The fire crackled between them. warm and steady. "Why did you ask me not to open it?" he said. "Because I knew what it would do to you," she said quietly. "I knew it would put you on a path that would be painful and dangerous, and I had already lost your father to this. I did not want to lose you too. You are not going to lose me, Mother." She studied his face for a long moment. "You look like him," she said softly. "Not your face, your eyes. You have the same look he had when he decided something, that quiet, stubborn certainty." She reached over and took his hand. "He would be proud of you, Emmett. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think about your father, he would be so very proud of what you did." They sat together by the fire for a long time, not speaking, just being in the same room, with the truth finally out in the open. The weight that Thomas Graves had carried was lighter now, shared between his wife and his son, and the pages of a court record in Habsburg. When spring came, the trials took their course. The courtroom in Habsburg was fuller than it had been for the hearing. Every seat taken, people standing in the back and along the walls. The territorial attorney had sent his best man, a sharp-eyed prosecutor named Wells, who took apart the 3 defendants' stories with surgical precision. Fenton broke first. He sat in the witness chair and looked out at the courtroom, at the faces of people he had done business with for 20 years, people who had trusted him with their money and their futures. And something in him collapsed. He confessed fully, his voice breaking as he described the night McCandless had called the 3 of them into his study and offered them each $500 to testify against Henry Calloway. "We were young," Fenton said, his hands shaking in his lap. "We were poor, and we were stupid, and we told ourselves it did not matter that Calloway was just some homesteader who was in the way. We told ourselves that for 20 years. Mackey followed a week later, his confession shorter and more bitter. He did not cry. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply stated the facts as if he were reading from a ledger, which in a way he was, a ledger of debts that had finally come due. Dunn held out the longest, maintaining his innocence with that cold, stony face. His lawyer argued procedural issues, questioned the reliability of 20-year-old documents, and attempted to discredit Agnes Fairchild's testimony on the grounds of her age. Agnes, who was sitting in the gallery when this happened, straightened her spine and gave the lawyer a look that could have frozen a creek in July. The jury was not impressed with the lawyer's tactics. The evidence was overwhelming. All 3 were convicted. The judge allowed them to keep their freedom until sentencing, owing to their age and the years that had passed. They would serve their time, but the greater punishment was already in place. The town knew, everyone knew, and in a small place like Ridgewood, being known for what you truly are is a sentence that never ends. Fenton closed his bank and moved away before the summer. Mackey sold the lumber mill to his foreman and was rarely seen outside his house. Dunn stayed, as stubborn in defeat as he had been in everything else. But the ranchers, who had once sought his business, now rode past his gate without stopping. On the first warm day of April, Emmett rode out to the old Calloway homestead. The road was muddy from the spring melt, and his horse picked its way carefully through the ruts and puddles. The valley was waking up after a long winter, the hillsides turning green in patches where the snow had retreated, the creek running high and fast with meltwater. The house was long gone, replaced by a barn that belonged to one of Dunn's operations, though Emmett doubted it would belong to Dunn much longer. But the land was still there, 40 acres of good grazing ground with a creek running through it. The grass was green with the new season, and a pair of red-tailed hawks circled in the clear blue sky above, riding the warm currents that rose from the valley floor. Emmett dismounted and stood in the field for a while, listening to the creek and the wind and the birds. He tried to imagine what this place had looked like 20 years ago, when Henry Calloway had built his home here. A small cabin, probably, with a garden out back and a fence for the livestock. A place where a man could stand on his porch in the morning and see the mountains to the west and the open valley stretching south, and feel that he had found something worth keeping. He thought about Henry Calloway, a man who loved this land enough to die for it. Though he had not meant to die, he had simply refused to give up what was his, and that refusal had cost him everything. He thought about Ruth, who spent her life fighting for a truth that nobody wanted to hear, writing letters that were never answered, collecting evidence that no one would look at, carrying her husband's memory like a torch through 20 years of darkness. She had died without seeing justice done, but she had made certain that the tools for justice survived her. He thought about Eliza, who had walked into a town that killed her father and stood there without flinching. She had sat in that courtroom and watched the men who destroyed her family be held to account, and she had done it with a grace and composure that humbled everyone who witnessed it. And he thought about his own father, Thomas Graves, who had written a note in the dark and slipped it under a door because he could not speak the truth out loud. It was not enough. Thomas had known it was not enough. He had spent the rest of his life knowing it was not enough, writing letters he could never send, sitting on a porch with a glass of whiskey and the weight of a dead man's eyes on his conscience. But it was something. It was a single act of honesty in a sea of silence. It was the first link in a chain that had held for 20 years and finally done its work. Emmett put his hat back on and mounted his horse. He took one last look at the valley, at the green grass and the running creek, and the hawks circling overhead. Somewhere, he thought, Henry Calloway was watching. And somewhere, Ruth was finally able to set her burden down. The road back to Ridgewood was familiar and easy. The same road he had ridden 1,000 times. But it felt different now. Lighter, cleaner. The trees along the way were budding with new growth, and the air smelled of wet earth and the promise of summer. He had one more stop to make. At the edge of town, he pulled up at the cemetery and walked through the iron gate. The cemetery was quiet and well kept. The graves marked with wooden crosses and stone markers, some new and some so old the names had worn away. He walked past the graves of people he had known, people his father had known, people who had built this town and lived and died in it, until he reached the new stone that marked Henry Calloway's grave. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers at its base, a small bunch of columbine and Indian paintbrush tied with a piece of string. He did not know who had left them, but he was glad. It meant that someone else in this town was remembering, was choosing to honor a man who had been wronged. He stood there for a moment, his hat in his hands. "It is done, Mr. Calloway," he said quietly. "It took too long, and I am sorry for that. But your name is clean. Your daughter knows the truth, and the men who did this will answer for it. I hope that is enough. I hope, wherever you are, it is enough." The wind moved through the cemetery, stirring the grass and carrying the sweet smell of spring. Emmett put his hat back on and walked to his horse. The sun was warm on his back. The town was waking up around him, going about its business, healing in the slow, ordinary way that life demands. He rode to his office, hung his hat on the hook by the door, and sat down at his desk. The folder from Eliza was in the top drawer. His father's letter was in the bottom one. Between them, a badge, steady and certain, doing the work it was always meant to do. And that is how I heard it told. The fire is getting low now, and the stars are coming out over the ridge. Some stories, they take a long time to finish, not because they are complicated, but because the truth needs patience. It needs someone willing to carry it, even when it is heavy, even when it hurts. Emmett Graves was that someone. His father tried to be. And a young woman named Eliza Calloway Foster walked into the town that took everything from her family and stood there, straight and sure, until the record was set right. You rest easy tonight, friend. I will be here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.